Hey guys, welcome back to the fourth and final video of this series, To the Brink of Freedom for Modern India. In this video, we're going to specifically talk about the build-up to World War II and how the tide really begins to turn for India in the direction of full freedom. Although full freedom does not come until after World War II, it becomes very evident by World War II that it's a matter of if. It's a matter of when, not if, for Indian independence. So with the success of the non-cooperation movement, with the success of the push for freedom from both the Muslim League and the Indian National Congress, the INC, the British government, British Parliament, and the King pass and approve the 1935 Government of India Act, where it allows a certain level of self-government in India that had not been previously allowed in previous Government of India Acts, because we see one in 1919 and then also in the aftermath of the Sepoy Mutiny in 1858. So again, that allows for the people of India to govern themselves in a very, very limited way, but again, it was a step forward. It was more self-government, self-governance for these Indians, and part of that is democratic elections for these people to elect individuals to represent them in a Congress or in a legislative body made up of native Indians, and that was huge for this movement to gain that concession from the British Empire, because it put them on a certain level where they were able to push more successfully for their own in their own interests. But for the most part, it wasn't as successful as a lot of people had hoped it would be, because it did face a lot of resistance from the population in India, because some of the groups, both British and native Indian groups, were not necessarily sure how this would impact them and take away from their own power at the time. So that, again, that faced a lot of resistance. But as for the independence movement, we see that the tension between the Hindus and the Muslims that we first saw with the split between the INC and the Muslim League still existed. They were still there, because a lot of it ties down to a simple question: what's going to happen after partition? What's going to happen after independence? Who is going to rule? Is it going to be a joint rule? Is it going to be one nation? Is it going to be the Hindu majority? Is it going to be the Muslim minority? Those questions were not answered. With the Government of India Act. Those questions were not answered with the Government of India Act. So we see that these groups were still vying for power and prominence, and that again built up that tension. And we see this continuing progressing through the 1930s. And for those of you who are not familiar, we see in the late 1930s the growth of, really throughout the 30s, but really in the middle to the later part of the 1930s, the growth of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, Nazi Germany. So with World War II beginning in 1939, we see that that as a part of the British Empire, India becomes a vital resource for the British, because they're facing the onslaught of the Nazi war machine in Europe, and they are in need of support from their colonies. And this is an important kind of part of this fight for independence, is that with the outbreak of conflict in Europe, the INC, so the Indian National Congress, this Hindu-dominated body, yes, they denounce Nazi Germany and the oppression and violence that they promote, but they don't outright support the British campaign against the Nazis. They are still pushing for this Quit India campaign, this Free India campaign, where they're trying to get the British government out. On the other hand, we see the Muslim League kind of going full in their support for the British. Not that the INC worked against the British, worked against the British, but they did not offer the same level of support that the Muslim League did. And as the war spreads through 1939, 1940, and then eventually with the advent of, or the, not advent, with the progression of the war to include the United States, and then the expansion of the war in Asia, India was a incredibly important piece of that puzzle to halt Imperial Japanese expansion. Right? We saw when we studied China, Japan was expanding all over Southeast Asia. Right? They were getting into the Philippines. They were getting into all those island nations in Southeast Asia. Right? With the rape of Nanking in China. So with this kind of bulwark of the British Empire in India, that was incredibly important for them. And by the end of the war, India, not to say that they were untouched, but they emerged as a definite world power. We see in terms of total industrial power, they are ranking, really in terms of population and industrial power, they're ranking in the top countries. Right? So fourth in industrial power and second in overall population. And that's an important thing to recognize, that with the end of World War II, that the Indians are gaining freedom, right? And they are being recognized as vital players on this world stage. And it really comes down to it in the aftermath of World War II, as many other British nations, it's not just or British colonies, it wasn't just India, but many of them are pushing for freedom. Right? And given the fact that the British really had to face reality in that they were beaten up pretty bad during World War II. They were simply exhausted, both as a nation, as a government, and as a nation. So they begin to negotiate a withdrawal. I'll say withdrawal. Yeah, withdrawal from India. But the question of who's going to rule, what is this? What is a independent India going to look like? Is a question. Is it going to be Hindus? Is it going to be Muslims? Are they going to split? It is something that ultimately had to be decided, and it's not something that was going to be resolved overnight. Where they're going to say, all right, it's going to be the Hindu side, it's going to be the INC, they're going to be ruled, or it's going to, and it wasn't going to be something that was just one-sided. All right, it took time for them to make this decision, and we see with Jinnah, a gentleman that we brought up and talked about before, with the Muslim League, he's pushing for a separate nation for Muslims, Pakistan, right, in the northwest region where Pakistan is right now, in the northwest region as a country for Muslims, right, predominantly Muslims, much like India is a predominantly Hindu nation, but the problem is that the lines between Hindu and Muslim in both areas is not strictly drawn, and we see this uncertainty kind of erupting in violence. And I know I have this example with Calcutta in just about a year after the end of the fighting in August of 1946, but violence was happening everywhere. It wasn't just in one city. It was all over India. And that really became a problem because we see in the process of that violence that thousands are being killed. Thousands, tens of thousands are being injured. And for Gandhi and the nonviolence, the civil disobedience movement, it was heartbreaking because a lot of it was Indians killing Indians, Hindus and Muslims killing each other, and that was a scary prospect because that was something where these people are going to be living together or living near each other when the British eventually leave. So what's going to happen when the British leave? And that's something that we'll talk about later when we get into the partition, because this violence doesn't go away when the British do eventually leave in 1947. It doesn't disappear. This animosity between Hindus and Muslims doesn't just dissolve away when their common enemy leaves. All right, talk to you guys later.